A 19-year-old open-water phenom vanished on a dawn swim. The town called it a drowning. Her father never did. 4 years later, he finds the first thing that isn't a memory, a salt-scarred GPS action cam bracket zip-tied beneath channel marker 7, the exact mount his daughter used. It wasn't there 6 months ago, which means someone put it there after she was gone. That single corroded piece of metal will tear open everything that kept this case quiet. 4 years ago, the search had been frantic. A fleet of Coast Guard cutters slicing white scars into the gray chop. Helicopters beating the air into a froth, their searchlights painting futile, sweeping cones onto the indifferent surface. Volunteers in RIBs and fishing boats shouting names into the wind. He'd been one of them, but different. While they scanned the surface, he went under. He was a rescue diver, retired, but the training was a language his body still spoke fluently. He descended into the murk of Black Horse Channel, the place she was last seen, a ghost in a world of ghosts. The water temperature that morning had been 54 degrees. He remembered the number because it was the same as the street address of their first home. Details like that became anchors, heavy and useless. He'd dropped below the turbulent surface layer into the green twilight where the world smoothed out. His breath was a slow, metronomic rhythm in the regulator, a mechanical heartbeat in the crushing quiet. Bubbles cascaded past his mask, silver spheres rising toward a sun that was just a diffuse, milky stain in the ceiling of his world. His beam cut a cone through the particulate haze. Kelp forests swayed in the surge, their long olive-drab fronds reaching like supplicants. He moved through them with an economy of motion born of 1,000 similar dives. Kick, glide, scan, kick, glide, scan. His eyes, trained to find a human form in the wreckage of a trawler or the cabin of a submerged car, searched for a flash of color. The bright pink of her swim cap, the blue of her wetsuit. Anything that didn't belong to the muted palette of the seabed. He followed the prescribed search patterns, a grid laid over chaos. He knew the currents here, knew them like a cartographer knows his lines. He understood how the ebb tide, exiting the bay, would fight the coastal drift, creating a shear line where objects could hang, suspended, before being pulled out to the deeper water of the strait. He'd told the lead commander this, showed him on the chart, his finger tracing the invisible rivers within the water. The commander, a man half his age with a crisp uniform and tired eyes, had listened patiently, nodded, and then stuck to the book. They searched where the computer models told them to search. Liam searched where the water told him to search. Days bled into weeks. The official search scaled back, then ceased. The helicopters were gone. The cutters returned to their patrols. The volunteers went back to their lives, their gazes now tinged with pity when they saw him at the marina, loading his tanks into the back of his rust-pocked truck. But Liam did not stop. He sold his small charter boat, the one he'd planned to use for comfortable retirement tours, and bought a used sonar array. He spent his evenings not in front of a television, but in front of a screen that painted the seafloor in ghostly shades of orange and blue, learning its contours, its secrets, its scars. He memorized every rock outcropping, every sandbar, every forgotten debris field from the cannery that had collapsed in the 70s. His daughter, Chloe, had loved this water. She was born of it, a creature of the tides. She wasn't reckless. At 19, she was a nationally ranked open-water swimmer, her discipline as hard and defined as her shoulder muscles. Her dawn swims were a ritual, a communion. She would text him from the beach access road, "In at 5:30 a.m. Gray whale just spouted off the point. Beautiful." And he would text back, "Track your buoy, watch the boat traffic." It was their liturgy. The last message was timed at 5:32 a.m. 4 years ago, 1,461 days ago. He'd found her towel and water bottle on the beach, exactly where she always left them. Her car was in the gravel lot. The tide was coming in. There was nothing else. The police concluded she was taken by a rogue current, a statistical anomaly, a tragic accident. The ocean gives, and the ocean takes. A neat, terrible summary. But Liam knew currents. He knew this coastline. And the official explanation felt like a poorly patched hull, a story that would hold water for a while, but would eventually, inevitably, give way. So he kept searching, not with the frantic energy of the first few weeks, but with the patient, methodical resolve of a craftsman. He became a feature of the coast, a silent figure in a dry suit descending into the gray water, his bubbles the only sign of his passing. He wasn't looking for a body anymore. He was looking for a reason, an answer that the deep, resonant silence refused to give up. He would dive the channel, the reefs, the kelp beds, following the pull of the tide, letting the water guide his search. He was hunting for a single, misplaced note in a vast, silent symphony. The present day was no different from the 1,000 days that had come before it. A blanket of fog, thick as wet wool, smothered the harbor, muffling sound and turning the world into a palette of grays. The clanging of the bellbuoy at the channel entrance was a lonely, percussive metronome counting out the seconds. Liam guided his 18-foot Zodiac, the Resolve, through the soupy air, the GPS his only reliable eyes. He wasn't searching today, not in the traditional sense. It was maintenance, his quiet civic duty. Over the years, he'd taken it upon himself to check the smaller, less critical channel markers, the ones the Coast Guard Auxiliary only got to a few times a year. He'd scrape away the gull droppings, check the solar panels on the lights, and make sure the hardware was sound. It was a way to be on the water with a purpose that didn't feel like picking at a wound. It was a way to maintain his own hardware. Channel Marker 7 was a skeletal steel tripod, painted a faded red, marking a submerged shoal that had claimed more than one careless keel. It stood alone, aloof from the main shipping lane. As he idled the Zodiac alongside, the rubber gunnel bumping gently against a rust-pocked leg, he saw it. Below the waterline, just visible in the murky green, was a dark shape lashed to the submerged crossbeam. Not algae, not a cluster of mussels. It was man-made, something black and angular, secured with what looked like heavy-duty zip ties. His heart, a slow and steady drum for 4 years, gave a single, hard kick against his ribs. He pulled on his gloves, his movements suddenly precise, deliberate. He leaned over the side, the cold water seeping into his sleeve, and reached down. His fingers closed around it. The zip ties were thick, brittle from years of saltwater immersion. He used the knife he kept sheathed on his belt, the serrated edge biting through the plastic with a series of dull clicks. The object came free in his hand. He laid it carefully on the boat's deck, on a clean, dry towel he kept for his equipment. It was a mounting bracket, salt-scarred, pitted, with blooms of white corrosion crusting its edges. But the shape was unmistakable. It was a universal mount for a GPS tracker and an action camera, the kind endurance athletes used to log their routes and capture footage, the kind Chloe used. He stared at it. The world narrowed to this single object. The fog, the clanging buoy, the cold, it all receded. Why would it be here? Zip-tied under the waterline of a tertiary channel marker. It wasn't dropped. It was placed, hidden. The location was specific, deliberate. Marker 7 was a quarter-mile from the main current flow of the channel, in a pocket of relatively slack water. An object lost in the channel wouldn't end up here. Not like this. He started the engine, the quiet outboard a sudden roar in the stillness. He didn't race back to the harbor. He moved with the same methodical pace as always, but now a current of something hot and sharp was flowing through him. For the first time in 1,461 days, he had a piece of the story that wasn't a memory. He had a thing. Back at the dock, He photographed the bracket from every angle against a grid mat, his old evidence collection habits from his rescue days kicking in. He documented its exact location on his chart. He placed the bracket and the severed zip ties into a sterile evidence bag. Then he made a call he hadn't made in over 3 years. Detective Miles Miller was a mainland transplant, a city cop who moved to the coast for a quieter life and found himself dealing with fishing disputes and summer tourist DUIs. He'd been the lead on Chloe's case. He was patient, by the book, and had always treated Liam with a careful professional sympathy that Liam found more tolerable than pity. Miller met him at the station, a small brick building that smelled of damp files and stale coffee. He looked older, his face etched with the same coastal dampness as the building. He listened without interruption as Liam laid out the discovery, his voice flat and even, betraying none of the seismic shift he felt inside. He placed the evidence bag on the desk between them. Miller picked it up, turning it over in his hands. "Under marker 7? You're sure? I checked the hardware on that buoy 6 months ago." "It wasn't there," Liam said. "It's been there a long time, the corrosion, the state of the ties, but not 4 years." This was the first twist of the knife. The timing felt wrong. "You think someone put it there after she disappeared?" Miller asked, his brow furrowing. "I don't know what I think," Liam said, the words tasting like a lie. He knew exactly what he thought. He thought this was a message or a mistake, a loose thread on a tightly woven garment. "It's a camera mount. Chloe used one exactly like it. Her gear was never recovered." Miller sighed, a long, weary exhalation. He looked at Liam, and for a moment, the professional sympathy was gone, replaced by a flicker of something else. Respect, perhaps, or maybe just exhaustion at the sight of this man's unwavering, lonely vigil. "Okay, Liam," he said, his voice quiet. "Let's treat it as evidence. I'll log it, get it to the state lab in the city. They've got a materials analysis unit that can tell us how long it's been in the water, maybe pull something off the metal. But I have to tell you, the odds—" "I know the odds," Liam interrupted, his voice still level. "Just find out what you can. And Miles, don't lose it on a shelf somewhere." The detective met his gaze. "I won't." Liam walked out of the station into the afternoon drizzle. The fog had lifted into a low, oppressive ceiling of gray. He felt a profound sense of dislocation. For 4 years, his search had been a conversation with the sea. Now, for the first time, it felt like something might be talking back. The bracket wasn't an answer, but it was a question, and it was a question asked by a person, not the tide. The call from Detective Miller came 2 weeks later. Liam was at his kitchen table, charts spread out under the low-hanging lamp, the same charts he'd been staring at for years. He was cross-referencing tidal patterns from the week Chloe disappeared with shipping logs from the Port Authority, a task he performed every few months, hoping a new detail might snag his attention. His phone buzzed, the name Miller flashing on the screen. He answered before the second buzz. "Liam, it's Miles. The lab report on that bracket came back." Liam's knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the table. "And?" "They confirmed a few things." Miller's voice was cautious, procedural. "The metal composition is a match for the brand of mount Chloe used. High-grade aluminum alloy. More importantly, the corrosion analysis is interesting. They estimate it was submerged for a minimum of 30 months, but likely no more than 40. So, somewhere in the 3-year range." Liam did the math in his head. Chloe had been gone for 48 months. So the bracket was placed at least 8 to 12 months after she vanished. The detail was a dissonant chord. Why move it? Why hide it a year later? "There's more," Miller said. Tucked inside the mounting plate, shielded from the worst of the corrosion, they found a microfragment, a piece of a memory card. It was shattered, but a sliver was wedged deep in the housing. Liam closed his eyes. He could feel the blood pounding in his ears. "Could they get anything from it?" "Their data recovery team are wizards. It's not much," Less than a second of corrupted data. A few frames of video, no audio. They're emailing me the file now. It's blurry, distorted. Send it to me, Liam said. Liam, I'm telling you, it's next to nothing. A smudge. Send it. The email arrived a minute later. The file was small. He clicked it open. A video player appeared on his screen. He hit play. It was a flicker. A brief, chaotic jitter of movement, lasting no longer than a heartbeat. He played it again and again. He slowed it down, frame by frame. The image was warped, discolored by data decay, but a few details emerged from the digital noise. The perspective was low to the water, the view of a swimmer. There was a slash of white against a dark background. The white was the wake of a boat. The dark was its hull. It was close, too close. On the hull, for a fraction of a second, a shape was visible, a logo. It was circular, blue, with a stylized white figure inside. A trident? A wave? It was impossible to be sure. It looked vaguely familiar, like a half-remembered brand from a magazine ad. He spent the next hour in a digital rabbit hole searching for logos of marine companies, boat manufacturers, local charter services. He found a dozen that were similar, but none were a perfect match. There was a popular brand of outboard engine, Neptune, that used a trident, but the design was different. A regional fishing charter, Bluefin Adventures, had a wave logo, but it was the wrong shape. It was a dead end, another frustrating piece of a puzzle with no edges. He printed out a still frame of the logo, the image grainy and indistinct, and pinned it to the corkboard above his charts. It hung there next to a photo of Chloe smiling, her face beaded with water after a race, a silver medal around her neck. Her eyes in the photo were bright with life and fierce determination. The blurry logo seemed to mock her. He called Miller back. The logo. Anything on your end? We're running it through a few databases, but it's too generic, too degraded. Without a clear company name, it's like looking for one specific fish in the ocean. The boat was dark, Liam said, thinking aloud, replaying the frames in his mind. Maybe navy blue or black. A planing hull, judging by the wake. At least 30 feet. It was moving fast. That describes half the boats in this harbor, Liam. I know. He felt the familiar cold tide of futility begin to creep back in. He had something new, something real, but it was leading him nowhere. It was a clue that only deepened the mystery. He thanked Miller and hung up. He sat at the table for a long time, staring at the grainy printout. The familiarity of it gnawed at him. He had seen it somewhere. Not on a boat, maybe. Somewhere else. He pulled out a box of Chloe's old things, items he hadn't been able to bring himself to throw away. Race packets, sponsor brochures, magazines. He started going through them one by one. He found brochures for wetsuit companies, goggle manufacturers, nutrition bars. Then he saw it. It was on the back of a program for the Pacific Coast Open Water Championship, a race Chloe had competed in the year she disappeared. The logo was listed under community sponsors. It was slightly different from the one in the video, cleaner, more stylized with text underneath, but the core design was the same. A blue circle, a white figure. The name read, Triton Marine Solutions. A quick search told him Triton was a marine logistics and equipment company, but their public face was philanthropy. They sponsored dozens of young athletes along the coast, providing scholarships, gear, and funding for travel. Chloe had applied for one of their scholarships once. She hadn't gotten it. He stared at the logo on the program and the logo on his corkboard. They were variants of the same design. A corporate logo for their public-facing sponsorships, and what looked like a simpler, cruder version painted on the hull of a boat. Why the difference? It was a small thing, a tiny inconsistency, but in Liam's world, tiny inconsistencies were where the truth hid. The boat in the video wasn't a corporate yacht. It was a workboat, and it was connected, however faintly, to a company that had a vested interest in the world of young, hopeful athletes like his daughter. The thread was thin, fragile, but he pulled on it. It was the only thread he had. The discovery of the Triton logo sent Liam back to his own archives, the meticulous records he had kept since the first day of the search. 4 years of tide tables, current charts, weather reports, and personal logs were stored in a series of waterproof Pelican cases in his small study. He opened the one marked Year 1. The air filled with the scent of aging paper and the faint salty tang of the sea. He was looking for a flaw in his own logic. For 4 years, he had operated on 2 parallel theories. The first was the official one: a tragic accident, a rogue current, an undertow, a medical event in the cold water. He had never truly believed it, but he had to constantly test it, to try and prove it, if only to be able to discard it with certainty. The second, more private theory was darker: an abduction, a crime of opportunity, a boat that came too close in the pre-dawn gloom. The fragment of video seemed to vindicate this second theory, but he needed to be sure. He unrolled the title chart for the morning Chloe vanished. He had stared at this piece of paper 1,000 times. It showed a strong ebb tide flowing out of the bay at nearly 4 knots. The police report had latched onto this, suggesting the powerful current had swept her out to sea. But Liam's finger traced a different path. Chloe swam in Black Horse Channel, which was partially sheltered from the main tidal flow by a long spit of land. The current there was an eddy, a slower, more complex swirl. He had placed drifter buoys in that channel dozens of times, at the same tide, in the same conditions. Most of them washed up on the beach less than a mile south. A few were pulled into the main current, but it took hours. She was a strong swimmer. She would have felt the pull. She would have fought it or angled toward shore. She would not have simply vanished. He folded the chart. The rogue current theory was dead. He had known it in his gut, but now he had eliminated it with cold logic. Next, he turned his attention to people. In the early days, the police had looked at everyone in Chloe's orbit: her ex-boyfriend, her friends, her competitors. The file on Maya Vance was thick. Maya was Chloe's main rival, a ferociously competitive swimmer from a neighboring town. There had been rumors of bad blood, of arguments after a contentious race. Liam remembered the police questioning her. She had been defensive, angry, but her alibi was solid. She was 200 miles away at a training camp. He found her number in an old contact list. He didn't know why he was calling, what he expected to learn. He just needed to hear it from her himself. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice wary. "Maya, it's Liam, Chloe's father." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Mr. Henderson," she said finally, her voice softer than he remembered. How are you?" It was a question no one knew how to answer for him. "I'm calling about Chloe," he said, skipping the pleasantries. "I'm looking at some things from back then. That race in Port Angeles the month before she disappeared, the report said you two had words." He could hear her take a shaky breath. "We did. It was stupid. I thought she'd cut me off at a turn buoy. She hadn't. I was just angry I was losing. I apologized to her the next day. We were fine. We weren't friends, but we respected each other. I wouldn't have hurt her. You have to know that." "I know," Liam said, and he realized he did believe her. The rivalry was a red herring, a dramatic but empty storyline. "Did she ever talk to you about her sponsors, or any sponsor offers?" "Not really," Maya said. "We all wanted a big gear sponsorship. That was the dream. She mentioned applying for that Triton scholarship. A lot of us did. They were the big one. They promised everything: coaching, travel, gear. Sounded too good to be true." "Did you get it?" Liam asked. "No. I don't know anyone who did personally. They were always at the events, smiling, handing out water bottles. But who they actually sponsored was a mystery." The conversation confirmed what he already suspected. Maya was a dead end. But her words, too good to be true, echoed in his mind. A few days later, another piece of the past resurfaced. Miller called. "Liam, something weird came across my desk. An interdepartmental memo from 4 years ago flagged for review. It's from the Port Authority Police to our department, dated the week Chloe went missing." "What does it say?" "It is a notification that a section of the marina's security camera system was down for maintenance that morning. Specifically, the camera covering the north launch ramp and the adjacent transient slips. It says the system was offline for a scheduled upgrade." Liam felt a jolt. The north ramp was the quietest part of the marina, rarely used by recreational boaters. It was the perfect place for a boat to slip in or out unnoticed. "Was it down for maintenance?" "That's the weird part," Miller said. "I called the Port Authority. They have no record of any scheduled maintenance that day. Their logs show the system was fully operational. They never sent this memo." "It was forged," Liam said, the pieces clicking into place. "Looks like it," Miller confirmed. "It's a professional job. Looks official. Someone in law enforcement, or someone who knew police procedure, wanted to create a blind spot in the investigation, right where and when it mattered. They wanted to make sure we didn't look too closely at the marina's security footage that morning because we were told there was nothing to see. It's a clever piece of misdirection." Liam stood up and walked to his corkboard. He looked at the grainy logo of Triton Marine Solutions. He looked at the map of the harbor, at the north launch ramp. He looked at the photo of his smiling daughter, a forged memo, a hidden camera mount, a mysterious scholarship program. These weren't the actions of a jealous rival or the random chaos of the sea. This was calculated. This was organized. Someone had not only taken his daughter, but had then methodically erased their tracks, planting false information inside the very investigation meant to find her. The search was no longer just about finding Chloe. It was about hunting the people who had covered their trail with such cold, professional precision. The red herrings were falling away, and the shape of the real predator was beginning to emerge from the fog. The annual Seafarer's Blessing was a long-standing tradition in the harbor town, a mix of solemn remembrance for those lost at sea and a hopeful celebration for the upcoming fishing season. The town square was filled with booths. The Coast Guard Auxiliary handing out safety pamphlets, a local restaurant selling chowder, and various marine businesses showcasing their wares. Liam usually avoided it. The event was a painful reminder of a community he no longer felt a part of, his grief an invisible wall between him and the cheerful crowds. But this year was different. He saw on the event program that Triton Marine Solutions was a primary sponsor. They would have a booth. He walked through the square, a gray ghost amidst the bright colors of nautical flags and branded windbreakers. He spotted the Triton booth immediately. It was the largest and most prominent, a sleek, modern setup with a large banner displaying their clean corporate logo. Video screens showed sweeping drone shots of dramatic coastlines and smiling young athletes surfing, kayaking, and swimming, all outfitted in Triton-branded gear. It was a slick, professional presentation of health, vitality, and corporate benevolence. And there, at the center of it all, was Julian Croft. Liam recognized him from the company's website. He was the CEO, a man who looked more like a retired athlete than a corporate executive. He was tall, with sun-bleached hair and a tan that spoke of a life spent on the water. He was shaking hands, laughing with city council members, and radiating a confident, easygoing charisma. He was the respectable face of the company that Liam now suspected had a much darker side. Liam approached the booth, his hands in the pockets of his worn canvas jacket. He bypassed the smiling junior employees and walked directly to Croft. "Mr. Croft," he said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the surrounding chatter. Croft turned, his smile unwavering. "Hello there. Can I help you?" "My name is Liam Henderson. My daughter was Chloe Henderson." He saw a flicker in Croft's eyes, a microsecond of recognition, quickly masked. "Of course," Croft said, his tone shifting to one of practiced solemnity. "A terrible tragedy. She was a remarkable athlete. We were all heartbroken to hear the news." "She applied for your scholarship program," Liam stated, not as a question. "Yes, we receive hundreds of applications from talented young people like Chloe. It's a very competitive process." Croft's posture was open, his expression one of sincere sympathy. He was good. Very good. Liam reached into his pocket and pulled out the grainy, pixelated printout of the logo from the video fragment. He held it out. "I'm trying to identify a boat. The logo is similar to yours, but not identical. Do you use a different version on your work vessels?" Croft glanced at the paper. His smile didn't falter, but Liam saw his knuckles tighten on the cup of coffee he was holding. It was the briefest of tells, but it was there. "That's not one of ours," Croft said smoothly, handing the paper back. "It's a common motif. The sea, the trident. A lot of smaller outfits use similar designs. I'm afraid I can't help you." He was already starting to turn away, signaling the end of the conversation. "The boat had a dark blue hull," Liam pressed, his voice still low and even. "It was in Black Horse Channel around 5:45 a.m. on the morning she disappeared." Now Croft turned back fully, his expression hardening almost imperceptibly. The mask of the friendly philanthropist slipped, just for a moment, revealing something cold and hard underneath. "That was 4 years ago. You have a good memory." "I have a perfect memory," Liam said. "For some things." A tense silence hung between them. The noise of the festival seemed to fade away. Croft's eyes were like chips of blue ice. He was assessing Liam, calculating. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Henderson," Croft said, his voice now devoid of its earlier warmth. It was a dismissal. "If you'll excuse me, I have guests." He turned his back on Liam and seamlessly re-engaged a conversation with a local politician, his charming smile snapping back into place as if on a switch. Liam stood there for a moment, the printout still in his hand. The confrontation had been short, subtle, but it had told him everything he needed to know. Croft's denial was too quick. His composure was too perfect. He hadn't asked where the photo came from or why Liam was asking. He had simply shut it down. Liam didn't leave the festival. He faded back into the crowd, finding a vantage point from a bench near the edge of the square. He watched the Triton booth for the next hour. He watched Julian Croft. He watched his employees. He paid attention to a man who stood at the edge of the booth, never speaking to the public, just observing. He was built like a dock piling, thick and solid, with a watchful, impassive expression. He wasn't wearing a Triton polo shirt like the others. He was security. Or something more. As the festival began to wind down, Liam saw the security man speak quietly into Croft's ear. Croft nodded. A few minutes later, 2 of the junior employees began packing up the promotional materials. Croft and the security man walked away, not toward the main parking lot, but toward the marina. Liam followed, keeping a safe distance, using the thinning crowd and the rows of parked cars for cover. His pulse was steady, his senses sharp. This was familiar territory. Tracking, observing. He followed them to the far end of the marina, to the old, semi-abandoned commercial slips that were slated for redevelopment. It was a place of ghosts, rusting trawlers, decaying pilings, the smell of creosote and neglect. A place no one would be paying attention to. And it was near the north launch ramp, the one from the forged memo. The threads were no longer just visible, they were weaving themselves into a rope. The abandoned section of the marina was a graveyard of ambition. Weeds grew through cracks in the concrete, and the weathered docks groaned underfoot with each shift of the tide. Liam moved silently, his soft-soled boots making no sound. He found cover behind a stack of old lobster pots, the decaying rope and wood offering both concealment and a familiar, pungent smell. From his position, he had a clear view of Slip 42. A vessel was moored there, a sleek 35-foot cabin cruiser with a dark blue hull. It was powerful and understated, with no name visible on the transom. Julian Croft and his thick-necked associate were standing on the dock beside it. They were not alone. A third man, lean and wiry with a grease-stained jacket, was working on an access panel near the boat's stern. Liam raised the small pair of binoculars he always carried in his jacket. He focused on the boat. It was clean, well-maintained, but it was a workhorse, not a pleasure craft. It had heavy-duty cleats, extra fuel capacity, and a reinforced davit on the stern for lifting heavy objects. He swept the binoculars along the hull, searching for the logo. There was nothing. It had been painted over. But he could see the faint, almost imperceptible outline of a circle beneath the fresh coat of marine paint. They had scrubbed its identity. The acoustics in the enclosed quiet slip were strange. Sound carried over the water. Liam could hear fragments of their conversation, words drifting on the damp air. "The new transducer is installed," the wiry man said, his voice tinny. "The side scan resolution is incredible. You'll be able to map every crack in that rock." Croft nodded, his voice a low rumble. "Good. The northern passage is treacherous. We can't afford any surprises. The shipment is next week. She has to be ready." "She'll be ready," the man assured him. "This system is military grade. You can see a coffee cup on the bottom at 100 feet. The security man spoke then, his voice flat and gravelly. "Is the thermal dampening system online? Last run, we got painted by a Coast Guard patrol out of Nia Bay." "It's online," the mechanic replied. "The engine baffling and the hull coating will reduce your thermal signature by 90%. On a foggy night, you'll be a ghost." Liam lowered his binoculars, his mind racing. Transducers, side-scan sonar, thermal dampening. This wasn't a pleasure boat. It was equipped for stealth and surveillance, and they were talking about a shipment and the Northern Passage, a notoriously dangerous stretch of coastline known for its jagged reefs and underwater caves. And the phrase that made the breath catch in his throat, "Map every crack in that rock." He watched as Croft handed the mechanic a thick envelope. The man nodded, packed his tools, and left without another word. Croft and his associate remained, talking in lower tones now, their conversation too faint for Liam to decipher. They stood there for a few more minutes before walking back the way they came, disappearing into the twilight gloom of the main marina. Liam stayed hidden, his heart hammering against his ribs. He waited. 10 minutes. 20. He needed to be sure they were gone. When the silence had stretched unbroken, he slipped from his hiding place and crept onto the dock, his steps light and careful. He approached the dark-hulled boat. The Venture, he would later learn it was called. He ran his hand along the hull where he'd seen the faint outline. The paint was new, still slightly tacky. He could feel the raised edge of the old paint underneath. A circle. He had no doubt what was under it. He looked into the cockpit, but the curtains were drawn. The boat was locked up tight. He couldn't get a clean shot. Not here, not now. He had overheard logistics, technical details, but it was all circumstantial. It was his word against a respected local philanthropist. He had no hard proof, nothing he could take to Miller that wouldn't sound like the desperate, paranoid rambling of a grieving father. He knew what they were doing in a general sense. This boat was being used for something clandestine, something that required avoiding the Coast Guard and navigating dangerous hidden routes. And their safety training dives, the ones they supposedly sponsored for young athletes, were the perfect cover to survey and map those routes. They weren't just sponsoring athletes, they were using them as unpaid, unwitting surveyors. And Chloe? What had happened to her? Had she seen something she wasn't supposed to? Had she stumbled upon one of their routes during her dawn swim? Or was it something worse? Was the scholarship a lure, a way to identify and recruit vulnerable young people for this shipment? The possibilities were chilling. He backed away from the boat, melting back into the shadows. He had reached the edge of what he could do alone. The risk of exposing himself was too great. He had followed the thread from the corroded bracket to the man in the bespoke suit, and now to this ghost ship in a forgotten slip. It was time to bring in the law. But he had to do it carefully. He had to give Miller something more than shadows and whispers. He had to give him a target. Liam didn't go to the police station. Instead, he called Miller and asked him to meet at a neutral location, a small, wind-swept park overlooking the strait. It was a place where they couldn't be easily overheard. The sky was a bruised purple, the last light of day bleeding away behind the mountains on the far shore. Miller arrived in his unmarked sedan, looking tired. He got out and leaned against the guardrail next to Liam, the wind whipping at his coat. "This better be good, Liam," he said, his voice laced with skepticism. "I'm supposed to be at my kid's band concert." Liam didn't waste time. He laid it all out, his voice a low, steady monotone. The confrontation with Croft at the festival, the way Croft reacted to the logo, following him to the abandoned slip, the boat with the painted-over hull, and the conversation he'd overheard, the side-scan sonar, thermal dampening, the northern passage, the shipment. As he spoke, he watched Miller's face. The detective's initial skepticism slowly gave way to a focused intensity. He was a good cop. He knew the difference between a conspiracy theory and a credible, detailed observation. "A boat named the Venture?" Miller asked when Liam had finished. "There was no name visible. But the details I overheard, that's what I'd call it. It's built for a purpose." "And you're connecting this to Chloe," Miller stated, his gaze fixed on the dark water below. "Triton sponsored athletes. They had a reason to be at these events, to be around young people like her. They have a vessel equipped for stealthy, dangerous navigation. They forged a police memo to create a blind spot at the marina on the morning she disappeared. The camera they disabled had a perfect view of that abandoned slip. It all connects, Miles." Miller was silent for a long time, the only sound the wind and the distant cry of a gull. "It's a lot of circumstantial pieces, Liam." "Pieces of what?" Liam pressed. "What's the shipment? Drugs? Weapons? People?" The last word hung in the air between them. Miller ran a hand through his hair. "Human trafficking. We've had whispers, interagency bulletins, small private vessels making runs up the coast, bypassing the major ports. The targets are often young, vulnerable people, promised jobs or opportunities. An athletic scholarship would be the perfect bait." The blood in Liam's veins went cold. He had considered it, but hearing a cop say it made it terrifyingly real. Chloe wasn't just a witness who had seen too much. She could have been the target. "We need more than whispers," Miller said, his voice now hard, all business. "We need to connect Croft and his company directly to that boat and to a criminal act. I can't get a warrant based on a conversation you overheard from 100 feet away." "The training dives," Liam said suddenly, an idea crystallizing. "Maya Vance told me Triton was famous for their sponsored training programs. They took athletes out for safety and navigation training. What if that was the cover?" Miller looked at him, his eyes narrowing. "A cover for what?" "To map the routes," Liam explained, the pieces falling into place with a sickening logic. "The northern passage is full of underwater caves, treacherous channels. You couldn't navigate it without a perfect map. They used the athletes and their GPS trackers under the guise of safety training to gather the survey data. They were mapping their smuggling routes, and the kids were doing the work for them for free. It was a brilliant, cynical scheme. It explained everything. The high-tech sonar on the boat was for fine-tuning the maps the swimmers had already roughed out." "If that's true," Miller said, his voice grim, "there will be a record. Triton would have had to file float plans, get permits for these training excursions. It would all look legitimate, but the locations would tell a story." They went back to the station. The place was quiet, most of the day shift gone home. Miller logged into the state's maritime database. He began searching for all permits and float plans filed by Triton Marine Solutions over the past 5 years. The list that came back was long. Dozens of entries, all looking perfectly normal. Safety dive training. Open water navigation seminar. But when Miller cross-referenced the GPS coordinates from the float plans with a detailed nautical chart of the Northern Passage, a pattern emerged. "Look at this," Miller said, pointing to the screen. The plots of the training dives weren't random. They weren't in safe, open water. They were concentrated in a series of highly specific, dangerous locations along the coast. They perfectly traced the deepest channels through treacherous reef systems. They clustered around the entrances to known underwater cave networks. One set of coordinates, from a dive logged 18 months ago, was just offshore from a labyrinthine system known to locals as the Devil's Throat. "They weren't training," Liam said, his voice barely a whisper. "They were charting a highway." This was the twist, the final horrifying piece of the puzzle that reframed everything. The scholarships, the philanthropy, the community outreach. It was all a sophisticated front for a criminal enterprise. The athletes weren't the beneficiaries of Triton's generosity. They were its tools. "And now we have the boat," Miller said, typing furiously. He ran a search for vessels registered to Triton or any of its known shell corporations. He found it. A 35-foot cruiser, the Venture, registered to a holding company that traced back to Julian Croft. Its home port was listed as the very marina where Liam had seen it. "We've got him," Miller said, a grim satisfaction in his voice. He picked up the phone. "I can get a warrant for that boat. I can get warrants for Triton's offices. We can get surveillance on Croft. But they're planning a shipment next week. We don't have time to build a long case. We need to catch them in the act." Liam looked at the map on the screen, at the cluster of data points around the Devil's Throat. He knew those caves. He had dived them years ago on a recovery mission for 2 divers who had gotten lost and never come out. They were a maze, a place to hide things, or people, or... "They're not just using the caves as a route," Liam said, a terrible certainty dawning on him. "They're using them as a holding area, a place to stash the shipment until the transport vessel arrives." The thought was like a physical blow. Chloe. Was it possible? After 4 years? Could she be alive, held somewhere in that cold, dark labyrinth? The hope was so sharp, so painful, it was almost indistinguishable from despair. But it was there. And for the first time in a long time, it was more than a ghost. It was a destination on a map. The next 48 hours were a blur of controlled, methodical chaos. Miller assembled a small, trusted team, looping in the Harbor Patrol and the Regional Coast Guard Command Center. A multi-agency operation was spun up with a speed that spoke to the severity of the intelligence. The warrants were signed by a judge at dawn. The targets were Julian Croft, the Venture, and Triton's corporate offices. The plan was to let Croft make his move. They would put him and the boat under tight but discreet surveillance. They would track the Venture when it left the harbor and intercept it at sea, hopefully with the shipment on board. Liam was officially a civilian consultant, a title Miller had invented to keep him in the loop. In reality, he was the operations compass, his intimate knowledge of the coastline and currents shaping the tactical plan. He sat in the briefing room, a sterile, windowless space that smelled of electronics and anxiety. He was surrounded by men and women in uniform, looking at satellite images and tide charts projected on a large screen. He felt a strange sense of detachment, as if he were watching a scene from his old life. But the stakes were infinitely higher now. Croft's pattern is to move on a new moon, under the cover of a heavy morning fog, Miller explained, pointing to a meteorological chart. We have both of those conditions converging in 36 hours. That's our window. A Coast Guard lieutenant commander, a woman named Riley, took over. We'll have a cutter, the Steadfast, positioned 10 miles offshore outside his expected route. A helicopter Jayhawk 60 will be on standby at the air station. Harbor Patrol will maintain a perimeter closer to shore. The goal is a clean stop. We want the boat, we want Croft, and we want the cargo intact and safe." Liam listened, his eyes fixed on the nautical chart. He traced the route from the harbor to the northern passage and the Devil's Throat. "He won't make it easy," Liam said, his voice cutting through the procedural calm. "He has thermal dampening. He'll be a ghost on radar and infrared, and he knows the water. He'll use the reefs and shallows to his advantage." "We'll be ready for that," Commander Riley said, her confidence unshaken. "There's something else," Liam continued. "He has a decoy." The room went quiet. "What do you mean?" Miller asked. "The day I saw him at the festival, Triton had another boat there. A smaller, faster speedboat, also dark-colored, used for promotional rides. It's a common tactic. He'll send the decoy out first on a different heading to draw your attention. While you're chasing it, the real boat, the Venture, will slip away." Riley and Miller exchanged a look. It was a variable they hadn't considered. They adjusted the plan. A smaller, faster harbor patrol boat would be tasked with shadowing and identifying any potential decoy, while the main assets stayed focused on the primary search area. The waiting was the hardest part. Liam went home but couldn't sleep. He sat at his kitchen table, cleaning and checking his old dive gear, the dry suit, the regulator, the tanks. It was a ritual, a way of focusing his mind. He hadn't worn this gear on a real mission in years, but his hands moved with an unconscious competence. Each buckle clicked into place, each hose was checked, each valve opened and closed with a familiar hiss. He was preparing for a possibility he barely dared to entertain. The call came before dawn. It was Miller. "He's moving. A boat just left slip 42. No running lights." Liam was already in his truck, the engine running. He drove to the command post set up at the harbor master's office. The room was dark, lit only by the glow of screens. On one, a radar display showed a single, faint blip moving out of the harbor entrance. "Is it him?" Liam asked. "We're not sure yet," Miller said, his voice tense. "And there's this." He pointed to another screen, showing a feed from a thermal camera positioned on the headlands. A second, much fainter heat signature was moving out through a narrow, shallow channel used only by small fishing boats. "That has to be him, the Venture." As predicted, the first boat, the decoy, suddenly switched on its lights and accelerated, heading due west at high speed. "There's the Rabbit," Riley said into her headset. "Harbor 1, you have the decoy. Intercept and identify. Jayhawk 60, you are green. Launch now. Vector to the primary target's last known position." Liam watched the faint thermal blip of the Venture as it hugged the coastline, using the landmass to mask its approach. Croft was good. He was sticking to the shallows, where a deep draft cutter couldn't follow. The helicopter was their best chance of tracking him. The chase was on. It wasn't a high-speed pursuit, but a tense, methodical game of cat and mouse played out in the pre-dawn darkness. The voice of the Jayhawk pilot crackled over the radio, calm and professional. "Command! This is Jayhawk 60. We have a visual on the target vessel. It's running dark, making for the northern passage. Confirm. Target is the Venture." "Roger that, Jayhawk," Riley responded. "Keep eyes on. Steadfast is moving to intercept." But the Venture was fast and agile. Croft knew exactly where he was going. He ducked behind a small rocky island, momentarily breaking the helicopter's line of sight. When he reappeared, he was heading directly for the chaotic maze of reefs that marked the entrance to the Devil's Throat. "He's going in," the pilot's voice said, a new urgency in his tone. "Command, he's entering the reef system. The cutter can't follow him in there. It's too shallow, too dangerous." Liam stepped forward, his eyes locked on the chart. "He's not trying to run," he said to Miller. "He's going to ground. He's heading for the caves. The helicopter can't see him in there. He's going to wait you out." A tense silence fell over the command post. The blip of the Venture disappeared from the screens as it entered the narrow channel leading into the cliffs. They had tracked him to his lair, But now he was in a fortress where none of their heavy assets could reach him. The chase was over. The next stage was about to begin, and it was a stage that Liam knew he was uniquely, terribly qualified for. The air in the command post was thick with frustration. The venture had vanished into the Devil's Throat, a place where radar, sonar, and helicopters were all but useless. The massive Coast Guard cutter, the Steadfast, was forced to hold its position a mile offshore, a powerful but impotent sentinel. Commander Riley was coordinating a containment strategy, placing smaller boats to block the known exits to the reef system, but everyone in the room knew it was a reactive measure. Croft had the advantage. He was on his home turf. He could stay in there for days, Miller said, pacing behind the main console. Wait for a storm, another foggy night, and slip out. He won't have to, Liam said quietly. Everyone turned to look at him. He was standing over the large, illuminated chart table, his finger tracing a path through the intricate network of channels and rocks. There's another way out, not for the boat, for people. He pointed to a specific spot on the chart. This cave system isn't a dead end. Part of it connects to a series of tidal chambers that have a landward exit, a blowhole high up on the cliff face. It's a hard climb, but it's possible. He's not planning to wait. He's planning to transfer his cargo and escape on foot. Riley and Miller came to stand beside him. "Are you sure about this route?" Riley asked. "I am," Liam said. "I've dived it." The memory was cold and sharp. The two lost divers, their bodies found in a silted-up chamber, their lights dead, their tanks empty. He knew the layout of that underwater maze because he had carried its casualties out of it. "Then we need to get a team in there," Miller said. "SWAT can rappel down the cliffs." "They'll be going in blind," Liam countered. "The caves are a labyrinth underwater. Pitch black, tight restrictions, disorienting currents. By the time they find the right passage, he'll be long gone. He'll hear them coming a mile away." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the room. "There's only one way to get to him before he moves. From the water. Quietly." The implication was clear. A long silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of the radio. Riley and Miller looked at each other, then at Liam. They saw the resolve in his eyes, the deep, weary competence of a man who was about to return to the place that had defined his life and his grief. "It's not a sanctioned operation," Riley said, her voice careful. "You're a civilian. The liability—" "There is no liability," Liam said, his voice flat. "There's only a chance that my daughter is in there. I'm not asking for permission. I'm telling you what happens next. You get me and my gear to the entrance. You hold the perimeter. I'll go in." An hour later, Liam was on the deck of a fast harbor patrol boat, slicing through the gray, choppy waves toward the cliffs. The sky was beginning to lighten, turning the fog from black to a pearlescent gray. The air was cold and tasted of salt. He was already in his dry suit, the familiar tightness a grim comfort. His rebreather unit, a closed-circuit system that produced no bubbles and was almost completely silent, was secured on his back. This was the gear of a ghost. As they neared the reef, the water became a churning cauldron. The boat's pilot, a young, serious-faced officer, expertly navigated the channels, his knuckles white on the helm. He brought the boat to a halt 50 yards from a dark, gaping fissure in the cliff face, the main entrance to the Devil's Throat. The sea surged in and out of it with a deep, guttural roar. "This is as close as I can get you," the pilot shouted over the engine and the surf. "The surge will do the rest." Liam checked his gear one last time. He pulled his hood over his head and settled his mask on his face. He looked back at Miller, who was on the boat with him, his face a mask of concern. "Be careful, Liam," Miller said. Liam just nodded. He put the rebreather's mouthpiece in, took a breath, and then without a splash, he rolled backward into the cold, dark water. The world went silent, the roar of the surf replaced by the deep, resonant hum he knew so well. He was home. He let the surge carry him toward the cave entrance. He was a piece of driftwood, inert and silent. He passed under the shadow of the cliff and was swallowed by the darkness of the cave. He switched on the high-intensity lamp mounted on his wrist. The beam cut a sharp white cone through the black water, illuminating a world of stone. The walls of the cave were slick with algae, carved by millennia of tides into grotesque shapes. He moved forward, pulling himself along the rock, his fins making slow, deliberate strokes. He was not just a diver, he was an infiltrator. Every sound, every movement was measured. He followed the main passage, his memory and the feel of the current his only guides. He passed the chamber where he had found the two lost divers years ago, a place he had tried to forget. He went deeper. The passage narrowed. He had to turn sideways, his tanks scraping against the rock. The pressure of the enclosed space was immense, a physical weight on his chest. Then he heard it. A faint, metallic sound. A clink. It was close. He doused his light. The blackness was absolute, disorienting. He held his breath, listening. He could feel the faint vibrations through the water. He was near the venture. He moved forward in the dark, one hand trailing along the wall. His hand touched something smooth and cold, the hull of the boat. He had found it. It was anchored in a large, hidden sea cavern, its engines silent. And then he saw a light, a dim yellow glow from an underwater hatch on the boat's underside. It was a moon pool, a diver's exit. As he watched, two figures emerged from the hatch, encased in dark dive gear. They were pulling something with them, a large, weighted net bag. It was the shipment. But then a second light appeared inside the boat, and another figure began to emerge. Croft. He wasn't leaving with the others. He was making a final check. A standoff was coming. Liam knew he couldn't take on three of them, not here. He needed to get past them, to the landward passage, to see if Chloe was there, to cut off their escape. He pressed himself into a crevice in the rock wall, a silent shadow in the deep, and waited for his moment to move. The real descent was about to begin. The two divers moved with practiced efficiency, their powerful lights cutting swaths through the black water. They towed the heavy bag toward a side passage, the one Liam knew led deeper into the cave system. Croft lingered by the moon pool for a moment, his light scanning the cavern, a final sweep for security. Liam held his position, motionless, his breathing slow and controlled in the silent rebreather. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Finally, Croft turned and followed his men, his light a receding star in the darkness. This was his chance. Liam pushed off from the rock, his movements fluid and silent. He didn't follow them. He swam in the opposite direction toward a different, smaller tunnel he remembered. It was a dangerous shortcut, a narrow restriction known as the Needle's Eye, but it would bring him out ahead of them, closer to the tidal chambers. He found the entrance, a tight, vertical fissure in the rock. He had to remove his rebreather unit, pushing it ahead of him as he squeezed his body through the opening. The rock pressed in on all sides, the rough texture scraping against his dry suit. For a terrifying moment, he thought he was stuck. He exhaled, making his body smaller, and pushed inch by agonizing inch. Then he was through. He was in a new passage, the water still and silent. He redonned his gear and moved on. He navigated the maze from memory, his light off, his senses attuned to the subtle shifts in current and pressure. He could feel the vibrations of the other divers moving through the system somewhere behind and below him. He was racing them. He reached the first of the large tidal chambers. Here, the water gave way to air. He surfaced cautiously in a pocket of breathable darkness. The air was cold and damp, thick with the smell of brine and wet stone. He could hear the drip of water from the ceiling high above. He switched on his light, keeping the beam low. The cavern was vast, the size of a church, the walls disappearing into the gloom. At the far end, a steep, scree-covered slope led up and out of the water. This was the transfer point, and at the base of the slope, huddled together, were two figures. They were wrapped in thermal blankets, their faces pale in the reflected glow of his light. One was a boy, no older than 17. The other was a young woman. Her hair was matted, her face thin and drawn, but he knew her instantly. It was Chloe. His breath caught in his throat. A sound, half sob, half gasp, escaped him. 4 years. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind 1,000 times, but the reality of it was overwhelming. He wanted to run to her, to hold her, but he couldn't. The mission wasn't over. Chloe looked up, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and confusion. "Dad?" The word was a faint, hoarse whisper, a sound he thought he'd never hear again. "I'm here," he said, his voice thick. "I'm here. We have to go. Now." He waded toward them. He saw that their ankles were shackled to a heavy chain bolted into the rock. And then he saw the complication. The boy's wrist was handcuffed to Chloe's. They were bound together. "Where are the keys?" he asked, his voice now sharp, professional. "He has them," Chloe whispered, nodding back toward the water. "Croft." Liam's blood ran cold. He could hear the sound of movement from the passage he'd just come through. The divers were close. There was no time to search for keys. He looked at the chain on their ankles. The bolt was old, rusted. He might be able to pry it loose, but the handcuffs were modern, case-hardened steel. He made a decision. He pulled a small, powerful set of bolt cutters from the pack on his back. He had brought them for just such a contingency. "The ankle chain first," he said. He positioned the cutters on a link. "Turn your heads." He squeezed with all his strength. The metal groaned, then snapped with a loud crack that echoed through the cavern. They were free from the wall, but not from each other. "The cuffs," Chloe said, her voice trembling. "You can't cut these." She was right. The bolt cutters wouldn't even scratch them. They were trapped. Just then, a light appeared in the water at the entrance to the chamber. One of Croft's divers surfaced, his head swiveling, his light beam searching. Liam reacted instantly. He shut off his own light and pushed Chloe and the boy behind a large rock formation. "Stay down. Don't make a sound," he whispered. The diver scanned the chamber. His light played across the walls, getting closer and closer to their hiding place. Liam knew he couldn't wait for the others to arrive. He had to act now. He took a deep breath and slipped back into the water, his knife in his hand. He circled around in the darkness, coming up behind the diver. He moved with the deadly grace of a predator. He grabbed the diver's air hose and sliced it through. The man thrashed, bubbles erupting from his damaged gear. He clawed at his throat, his light spinning wildly, illuminating scenes of chaos on the cavern walls. Liam didn't wait to watch. He kicked hard, propelling himself back toward the surface where Chloe and the boy were hidden. The second diver and Croft would have heard the commotion. They would be coming. "We're going up," he said, grabbing Chloe's free arm. "The blowhole. It's our only way out." He led them to the scree slope, half pulling, half carrying them. The climb was treacherous, the loose rock shifting under their feet. The handcuff was a terrible complication, forcing them to move in a clumsy, three-legged race against time. Below them, 2 more powerful lights broke the surface of the water. Shouts echoed in the vast chamber. They had been seen. The final escape had begun. The climb was a desperate, vertical scramble. Loose shale slid away under their feet, clattering into the darkness below. Liam was the anchor, his body braced, one hand gripping Chloe's arm, the other finding purchase on the slick rock. The boy, whose name he learned was Alex, scrambled beside them, his movements clumsy with fear and exhaustion. The handcuffs that bound him to Chloe were a constant, dangerous impediment, threatening to throw them both off balance. Below, Croft's voice echoed up, sharp and furious. "Don't let them reach the top!" A beam of light pinned them against the rock face. A moment later, there was a sharp crack and the whine of a ricochet. He was shooting at them. Liam shoved Chloe and Alex into a shallow alcove. "He's trying to start a rock slide. Bring us down," Liam said, his voice grim. He peered over the edge. Croft and his remaining man were starting to climb, moving with an unnerving agility. They were closing the distance. "We're not going to make it," Alex panted, his voice thin with terror. "Yes, we are," Chloe said, her voice finding a flicker of the iron resolve Liam remembered. She looked at her father, her eyes clear in the reflected light. "What's the plan, Dad?" Seeing that strength in her, after everything, was like a jolt of adrenaline to Liam's heart. "The plan is to move," he said. He pointed upward. "The passage to the blowhole is another 20 feet up. It levels out. We can move faster there." He led them out of the alcove, scrambling from one handhold to the next, using his body to shield them. Another shot rang out, closer this time. Liam felt a sting in his arm, a hot line of pain. He ignored it. He was running on something more powerful than blood now. They reached the passage, a narrow, horizontal crack in the rock. They crawled inside, the sounds of their pursuers momentarily muffled. The tunnel was tight, forcing them to move on their hands and knees. The air was thick with the smell of the ocean, and they could feel a faint breeze on their faces. They were close. They emerged onto a wide ledge, directly below the blowhole. High above, a circular opening showed a patch of gray pre-dawn sky. The roar of the surf was louder here, funneling down the natural chimney. A series of weathered iron rungs, relics from an old lighthouse service, were set into the rock wall leading up to the surface. It was their ladder to freedom. "Go," Liam urged, pushing Chloe toward the rungs. "You first. I'm right behind you." Chloe and Alex started to climb, their chained wrists making the ascent awkward and slow. Liam turned back to the passage, his dive knife in his hand, ready to make a stand. But Croft didn't come through the tunnel. A noise from above made him look up. Croft's other man was rappelling down from the surface, a black spider on a rope blocking their exit. He had a gun in his hand. They were caught in a pincer. Suddenly, the roar of the surf was overwhelmed by a new sound, a rhythmic, mechanical beating that grew louder and louder. Helicopter blades. Jayhawk 60. A brilliant white searchlight flooded the blowhole, turning the gray dawn into day. "This is the U.S. Coast Guard!" a voice boomed from a loudspeaker, amplified and distorted by the rock walls. "You are surrounded. Drop your weapons." The man on the rope hesitated, caught in the spotlight. From the passage below, Croft emerged, his face a mask of fury as he realized the tactical situation had collapsed. He was trapped, but he wasn't surrendering. He raised his pistol and fired at the helicopter. It was a futile, desperate act of defiance. Liam saw his chance. While Croft was distracted, he lunged. It wasn't a fight. It was a collision. He slammed his shoulder into Croft's chest, driving him back against the rock wall. The gun clattered from Croft's hand, skittering across the ledge. Croft was strong, fueled by rage, but Liam was driven by 4 years of cold, patient grief. He was relentless. They grappled on the narrow ledge, a desperate struggle over a black abyss. Below, Liam could see Miller and a SWAT team entering the main cavern on inflatable boats. The game was over. Croft knew it too. With a final snarled curse, he shoved Liam away and made a desperate leap, not for the passage, but for the water far below. He chose the abyss over capture. Liam didn't watch him fall. He turned and looked up. The man on the rope had dropped his weapon and was surrendering to the tactical team now descending from the helicopter. Liam climbed the rungs, his injured arm protesting with every movement. He reached the ledge where Chloe and Alex were huddled. He knelt in front of his daughter. He reached out and gently touched her face, his gloved fingers tracing her cheekbone. Her eyes were full of tears, but she was smiling. "You came," she whispered. "I told you I'd always track your buoy," he said, his voice breaking. A medic rappelled down and, with a heavy-duty set of cutters, finally severed the handcuff that bound Chloe and Alex. The snap of the metal was the sweetest sound Liam had ever heard. He wrapped his arms around his daughter, holding her for the first time in 4 years. The weight of his search, the burden of his grief, finally lifted, replaced by the impossible, miraculous reality of her in his arms. On the cliff top, under the rising sun, the fog was finally beginning to burn away. The aftermath was a world of quiet procedure and jarring contrasts. The harsh, efficient noise of the rescue operation, the helicopter, the radios, the shouted commands, gave way to the hushed, sterile environment of the hospital. Liam sat on a plastic chair in a hallway that smelled of antiseptic, a bandage on his arm where the bullet had grazed him. He watched through a small window in a door as doctors and nurses attended to Chloe and Alex. They were dehydrated, malnourished, but alive. The story that emerged in fragments was a nightmare. Chloe had been on her dawn swim when the venture had deliberately cut her off. They hadn't meant to hit her, just to intimidate her, to scare her away from an area they were surveying. But they misjudged their speed. The boat's propeller had struck her, not a fatal blow, but enough to incapacitate her. Panicked, they pulled her from the water. They couldn't let her go. She had seen the boat, so she became their first prisoner. Alex, another young athlete on a Triton scholarship, had been taken 6 months ago when he started asking too many questions about the training dives. They were held on the boat, moved between remote anchorages, and then finally to the cave system to await transport to a buyer overseas. They were the shipment. Detective Miller found Liam in the hallway. He looked exhausted but satisfied. "Croft's body was recovered," he said, his voice low. "His second-in-command is in custody and singing like a canary. The whole network is coming down. We've identified shell corporations, offshore accounts, and a list of buyers. We're making arrests up and down the coast. You didn't just find Chloe, Liam. You dismantled a massive trafficking ring." Liam nodded, but the words barely registered. The scope of the crime, the scale of the victory. It all felt distant. The only thing that felt real was the image of his daughter's face in the cave. "The bracket," Liam said, a stray thought surfacing. "Why did they move it? Why hide it under the marker a year after she was taken?" "The diver we captured in the cave told us," Miller explained. "He was the one who did it. He was a former sponsored athlete himself, coerced into working for Croft. He said Croft kept the camera, with its footage of them hitting Chloe, as a kind of insurance, a way to keep everyone in line. About a year in, the diver started having a crisis of conscience. He couldn't go to the police, but he wanted to leave a trail, a clue, in case something happened to him. He stole the camera's mounting bracket. The camera itself was kept by Croft, and zip-tied it to the most obscure marker he could find on his survey route. He hoped someone, someday, might find it. He said he chose marker 7 because it was in a slack current. He didn't want the tide to take it. It was the final piece. A small act of desperate courage from one of Croft's victims. A message in a bottle that had, against all odds, found its way to the one person in the world who would know how to read it. A few hours later, Chloe was released. She was wearing borrowed hospital scrubs, her steps unsteady but her own. Liam walked with her out into the bright, clear afternoon. The fog was completely gone, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. They didn't talk much. The space between them was filled with an understanding that words couldn't touch. He drove her home, to the small house by the water that had been a silent monument to her absence for so long. She walked into her old room, untouched, a time capsule from her previous life. She picked up a photograph from her desk, the one of her and Liam on his old charter boat, both of them smiling into the sun. Liam stood in the doorway, watching her. The reunion wasn't a sudden, cinematic explosion of joy. It was quieter, more profound. It was the end of a long, cold tide and the slow, steady turning toward the warmth of the shore. It was two people learning how to breathe the same air again. That evening, they sat on the edge of the small dock behind the house. their feet dangling just above the water. The sea was calm, the surface like dark glass reflecting the first stars. For 4 years, the water had been his adversary, a cold, silent keeper of secrets. Now it was just the water again. Chloe leaned her head on his shoulder. Her presence was a solid, warm weight against him. "I knew you'd be looking," she said, her voice quiet. "Even in the dark. I knew you were out there." Liam didn't answer. He just put his arm around her. He looked out at the lights of the harbor, at the slow, rhythmic sweep of the lighthouse beam on the point. On the table inside, his charts and tide tables lay spread out, their intricate lines and numbers finally at rest. The search was over. The current had, at last, brought his daughter home.